She ruled with silence, the kind of silence that followed explosions, that lingered after screams stopped echoing. No planet had ever defied her and survived. But when she returned to her throne and found her child trembling with hunger, no tech, no medic, no general could calm the sobs. Until a captured human, a single father from a broken world, stepped forward with a bowl of food, and something ancient in her stopped cold. She forgot war. She forgot titles. She just watched. And for the first time in her life, she didn't know what to do. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from: city, starport, or outpost. And if this story moves something quiet in your chest, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale might just challenge everything you thought you knew about power, purpose, and love. The palace at the heart of Arathian Prime had been built to withstand solar bombardment, but it could not withstand a child's cry. It echoed off titanium walls, slipped beneath sound-dampened doors, and vibrated in the bones of every soldier who passed the throne corridor. For all her power, the queen could not stop it. Her daughter, the heir to 1,000 conquered systems, wept with a sound that made generals flinch. Med drones had scanned her twice. The air was pure, the temperature optimal, the biometric rhythm stable. And yet she cried. Not from pain, but from something worse, something no algorithm could soothe. Hunger. The caretakers brought nutrient paste infused with precision-calibrated amino chains. She slapped it from their hands. They tried synthetics sculpted to look like food. She wailed louder. No one dared speak above the sound. Not even the queen. She stood above the crib, expression carved from obsidian, unmoved. But inside, her mind raced. This made no sense. Her child had never refused sustenance. She had never cried like this. And for all the queen's iron control, her fingers twitched helplessly at her sides. Something primal, something mother-shaped and long repressed, clawed at the edges of her restraint. The guards outside her chambers barely noticed the figure who paused at the door barefoot, collar still locked around his neck, hands held in open submission. He'd been assigned to sanitation in the lower quadrants. A human, one of the last prisoners taken from Terra 3 before its orbital collapse. But now he stood here, not with defiance, not with plea, just with something strange in his eyes. Recognition. I know that cry, he said quietly. My daughter used to make that exact sound when she missed dinner by an hour. A blaster was aimed at his head in a second, but he didn't flinch. He didn't beg. He simply looked at the queen, then at the child, then back again. Let me cook something, he said. Real food, no supplements, no synth meats, just real. The queen stared at him like he'd grown a second head. No human had spoken directly to her since the fall of his kind. No one suggested things to her, least of all prisoners. But in the crib, her daughter's cries hit a frequency that made even her vision blur. 10 minutes, she said flatly. They brought him to a holding galley with barely functioning heat coils. He asked for roots, herbs, broth, got half of what he needed. Still, he worked with hands that didn't shake. He stirred with the quiet precision of a man who'd done this too many times under too many pressures. And when the stew was done, when he poured it into a small ceramic bowl and carried it back into the throne room, no guard stopped him. The baby saw him. The crying stopped mid-breath. She reached for the bowl like it was the Sunday, and in that moment, the Queen of Arathian forgot how to breathe. The bowl looked like nothing special, no sacred metals, no embedded circuitry, no royal insignia, just a smooth, plain ceramic curve hand-fired, slightly chipped on the rim, steam rising from the broth like breath from an old animal. But to the child curled in silk-lined blankets of a throne world, it might as well have been magic. She held it in both hands, wobbling with the weight, eyes wide and reflective as twin moons. The scent curled into her nostrils, unfamiliar, warm, earthy. It smelled like soil, like wood smoke, like memories that weren't hers. Then she drank, one slurp, cautious. Another, deeper. By the third, she didn't pause to breathe. Her little purple-blue fingers clutched the bowl like it was a star about to fly away. The room had gone still. Even the ventilation system seemed to quiet, as if the entire palace leaned forward to watch this impossible thing happen. The queen didn't move, but something in her posture loosened, like a statue touched by rain. She hadn't spoken since the food arrived, hadn't blinked. The generals behind her exchanged glances. They looked at each other like witnesses at the edge of a battlefield, waiting to see which way the death would fall. One wrong word, they all knew, and heads would roll. But no order came. The Queen's eyes never left the child. The human didn't kneel. He didn't bow. He simply stood there, arms crossed lightly over his chest, watching the girl eat with a quiet, tired smile. He looked out of place, and somehow more at home than anyone. Dust on his boots, grease in the stitching of his jumpsuit. A small patch on his shoulder faded, and illegible that might have once said, "Emergency rescue," or maybe it was just a memory. His gaze softened when the child slurped again, noodles clinging to her chin. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a square of cloth, and offered it gently. She took it, wiped her face, then crawled into his lap without a word. No one had told her to. No one had seen her move like that before. She just climbed, curled against him, and let out the kind of sigh that only full bellies and safe arms can summon. The human held her loosely, like he'd done this before, not recently, but long enough ago that it hurt to remember. A guard cleared his throat, stupidly. "Shall I touch them?" the Queen said, voice flat as a blade. "And your bones will decorate my gate." The room froze again, but it was too late. The moment had shifted. The child was asleep now, in a prisoner's lap, bowl empty, heart full, and the woman who had enslaved 9 planets was still staring. Somewhere in her lungs the breath returned. But she didn't speak. She just turned and walked away, because for the first time in years, someone else had done what she couldn't, fed her daughter. The War Council convened in the Obsidian Chamber beneath the palace. 12 generals, 6 strategists, 3 Grand Inquisitors, and 1 Imperial biophysicist. The table was cold, curved like a scythe, each seat calibrated to species-specific posture requirements. Yet none of them sat comfortably. The Queen stood at the head, silent, armored, unreadable. And at the center of the table hovered a projection, the human. Candid footage him in the throne room, holding the child, her sleeping against his chest, his hand on her back, slow and steady. "This," spat General Vroth, mandibles twitching, "is contamination. He is manipulating her," said the biophysicist, her lenses blinking in rapid succession. "Using scent memory, neural imprinting, primitive attachment theory, he must be removed before imprint stabilizes." "He's already inside the royal orbit," added another. "Every second he stays, your daughter becomes more mammal than monarch." They argued for 20 minutes before someone had the courage to ask the unthinkable. "Why didn't you kill him?" The Queen didn't answer right away. She simply walked around the table, gaze flicking across the advisors like a storm circling a valley. "Because she ate," she said. 3 words, heavy enough to silence a room trained in war. "For the first time in days, none of you achieved that." They exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't strategy. It was something older, messier. They couldn't calculate it, and that made it dangerous. "Then use him as a tool," suggested Vroth. "Let the child feed from his familiarity, then discard him when the need passes. We can copy his scent, synthesize tone patterns." The Queen paused. "You think she is a device to be calibrated? She is the future of your empire," Vroth countered. "She cannot be allowed to bond with prey." Silence fell like frost. The Queen exhaled slowly. "Assign the human to the child." Murmurs erupted. "My queen, that's full-time," she said. "Guarded, watched, but uninterrupted. But what precedent does?" "I am the precedent," she snapped. "If any of you question that, say it clearly so I can decorate my throne with what's left of you." No one spoke. In the days that followed, the human was not escorted back to the cells. He was given a chamber. Spartan, yes, no windows, no weapons, not even a mirror. But his door opened every morning to the same soft sound, a tiny hand knocking. The child came to him now, with curiosity, with trust. He fed her, told her stories, laughed when she smeared food on his shirt. He never overstepped, never asked questions, just existed. And the Queen, she watched from surveillance chambers at night, frame by frame, breath tight in her chest. A man who never bowed, a girl who finally smiled. She did not understand the shape of what she was feeling, but she understood one thing. If this was a threat, it did not feel like one. It felt like something else entirely. By the end of the first week, they had a rhythm. Not a schedule. Schedules were for machines and missions. This was something quieter, older, more human. The child would wake with a soft whimper before the palace lights shifted. She would pad barefoot through the corridor, ignore the guards, and knock twice on the human's door. He'd be waiting, bowl in hand. Same contents, different spices. He'd tell her she could help stir next time. She never said yes, but she always watched. They ate cross-legged on the floor, a small ritual in a massive room. Then came games. He taught her to stack odd-shaped cups in towers and knock them over with laughter that bounced off the cold steel. She started naming them. "This one is you," she said once, pointing at the crooked one. "Because you wobble." He laughed harder than she expected. The next day, she hid behind his leg when the guards came too close. The palace didn't know what to make of it. Surveillance teams recorded everything. Advisors whispered theories like poison into the queen's ear. Emotional infection, dependency disorder, regressive imprinting. One even suggested partial mind-wiping for the child. The queen didn't respond. She was watching, not from afar this time. Sometimes, she stood behind tinted glass, unseen. Other times, she lingered in the doorway just long enough for her daughter to look up, smile faintly, and return to whatever game they were playing. The queen never joined, never spoke, but she stayed longer than protocol allowed. The man said little to her directly. He was always respectful, always quiet. But there was something in the way. He looked at the child, something unmeasurable. Not awe, not reverence, just a memory. Like he wasn't just watching her grow, he was remembering someone else, shrinking. Once, when the child scraped her knee against a piece of fallen armor, she cried out, not loudly, just a whimper, enough to freeze every muscle in the queen's body. The guards stepped forward, but before they could reach her, he was already kneeling. He lifted the child gently, inspected the scrape, and kissed the edge of it like it was sacred. No words, just care. She stopped crying. The queen didn't speak. But later, alone, she walked the length of her private training hall and punched a reinforced pillar until blood seeped through her gloves. Not from rage, from something worse. Confusion. In her entire empire, not one creature had ever comforted her that way. Not her generals, not her advisors, not her own mother. That night, she stood outside the child's room, heard her giggle in her sleep. Inside, the human sat nearby, rubbing a cloth in circles over the floor, humming softly. A melody not meant to conquer, not meant to survive, just meant to calm. And in that quiet, the queen didn't think of power or fear or empires. She thought only of what it might be like to feel that song against her own skin. The queen did not dream often. Her species had engineered sleep cycles into algorithmic blocks long before her birth, efficient, regulated, stripped of the messiness of emotion. But that night, slumped in the corner of her private chamber, armor peeled halfway off like discarded shell, she slipped under. And when she did, the dream came not as a vision, but as a smell. Soup, not synth paste or protein fog, but real broth, root and herb, something warm, something that softened the air before it touched the lungs. She saw a hand large, calloused slide a bowl across a stone floor. No words, just an offering. And then a voice, humming low, the same melody she'd heard outside her daughter's room. She woke with a breath caught sideways in her throat. Her pulse stuttered. It was not memory, she told herself. It was infection. The human had infiltrated her mind, contaminated her perimeter. That must be it. Yet her hand trembled when she reached for the cup of enzyme tonic by her bedside, the way it had when she was small, before she was taught never to shake. That morning, she did not take her throne. She walked unannounced to the corridor where her daughter played. No guards, no ceremony. Just the human, sitting cross-legged, showing her how to roll strips of dough into spirals. The child was focused, tongue pressed to her lip in concentration. her tiny hands smeared with flour. She looked up and beamed when the Queen entered. "Mama," she chirped, holding up the mess of a spiral like a trophy. "Look, food that looks like a star." The Queen blinked. No one had called her that in years. Not mother, not even queen, just weapon, just sovereign, just rule. But the child said it like it was the most natural thing in the galaxy. The human didn't stand. He just nodded once. She asked to help this morning. Said she didn't want to just eat. She wanted to give back. The Queen said nothing. Her gaze drifted to the dough, to the child's hands, to the flour dust rising like ancient smoke. And then, without command, she, Saturday, on the floor, beside them. The child giggled and offered her a strip. "You try." She hesitated, took it, rolled it awkwardly. It collapsed halfway through. "You'll get better," the child said, matter of fact. "Daddy says we all start messy." The human froze, just briefly. She'd never called him that before. The Queen stared at the ruined dough in her palm. Then, impossibly, she laughed. Not cruelly, not bitterly, just softly. And in that one sound, a window opened inside her to a day she had long buried. A day when someone once had held her hand and said, "You don't have to be sharp to be strong." That was the last time anyone touched her without fear. Until now. She noticed it by accident. The child had fallen asleep early, face buried in the folds of the human shirt, one hand still sticky with syrup from the sweet-root pastries they'd made together. He'd shifted carefully, cradling her head with one palm, the other hand reaching up to tug at the collar of his jumpsuit. That's when the fabric slipped. Just for a second. Just enough for the Queen to see it, a jagged, pale scar tucked beneath his collarbone. Old, ugly, deep. The kind that doesn't come from battle. The kind that comes from survival. She didn't ask about it then. Didn't need to. She'd seen that kind of mark before on slaves, on rebels, on the broken. But there was something different in the way he carried his. No shame, no bitterness, just stillness. Like the scar wasn't a wound anymore. It was a story, one he wasn't finished telling. The next evening, she entered his quarters without announcement. The child was asleep again, curled in blankets of her own design, scraps of cloth he'd sewn into a patchwork cocoon. The man sat in the far corner, eyes closed, breathing slow. She stepped in, quiet as breath. "You served?" she asked. His eyes opened, calm. "No." She waited. He didn't elaborate. "That scar wasn't from war," he said. "It was from a hospital." She frowned. "They don't give those for healing." He smiled, faint and sad. "No, but they do leave them behind." The Queen crossed her arms. "Explain." He glanced toward the child, then leaned forward slightly. "My wife died giving birth. Too much internal bleeding, not enough help." I held her hand, but... He stopped, swallowed. "She made me promise I'd raise our daughter to feel safe, even if the world wasn't." Silence stretched long between them. "You failed," the Queen said coldly. He didn't flinch. "I did. She was taken before I could keep that promise. And yet you smile." He looked down at his hands. "Because now there's another child. One who's scared in ways she doesn't know how to say, and I still remember how to help." She stared at him, searching for weakness, for softness that could be exploited. But all she saw was quiet resolve. Not defiance, not submission. Just a man who had nothing left to prove except to a little girl who needed a full stomach and a steady hand. The Queen turned to leave, but before she stepped through the threshold, she paused. "Does it still hurt?" He looked at her. She gestured to the scar. "When you breathe." He nodded once. "Only when I forget why it's there." She said nothing, but hours later, long after midnight, she stood alone on her balcony, looking down at her empire cities she had crushed into order, skies her ships had scorched clean, and wondered if maybe, just maybe, her crown had hidden more scars than it ever prevented. And for the first time, she let herself feel one. It began with a cough, small, dry, barely noticeable. The child had just finished laughing, chasing the human through the edge of the throne corridor, arms outstretched, crumbs on her face, joy in her breath. But then came the cough, and another. Her smile faltered. She swayed, The human caught her mid-step. She clung to him, trembling. The queen was in the next chamber. She heard it, not the sound itself, but the silence that followed. The kind of silence that comes when something important slips out of place. She entered without ceremony. One look at her daughter's face told her everything. The child was sweating despite the cold. Pupils dilated, lips tinged slightly gray. The human met her gaze. "She's been poisoned." A general stepped forward. "That's not possible." The food was scanned. It wasn't the food. The human snapped. It was the spoon. Everyone froze. The queen knelt not as sovereign, but as mother, and placed her palm against the child's forehead, burning. Her daughter whimpered, trying to speak but too weak to form words. "Who had access to the utensils?" she asked without rising. The guards glanced at one another. "Answer me." A young lieutenant stepped forward. "They were pre-approved. From the imperial kitchen. No contaminants detected." The queen stood slowly, the air around her thickening like the calm before orbital fire. "Get out," she said. Everyone moved, except the human. "She needs treatment," he said. "Not tech, not drones. She needs binding root, raw, crushed, boiled. Human medicine, ancient. We used it for fever poisons on Terra." She stared at him. "That's primitive. It works. She's not human. She's close enough," he said. "Please." That word "please" had never echoed in the throne room before. It sounded like defiance and surrender all at once. She hesitated, and then she did something no one had seen in decades. She dropped her weapon. Her blade, forged in the forges of collapsed suns, clattered to the floor with a ringing finality. It rolled in a slow circle, then settled, pointing toward the door. The guards watched in stunned silence. "Get him what he needs," she said. The human moved fast. Water boiling, leaves crushed with the hilt of a ceremonial goblet. He worked by feel, by instinct, by memory. He poured the brew into a small cup and held it to the child's lips. She drank. Minutes passed like hours, then a breath, deep, full. Her color returned, and she opened her eyes. The human smiled. There she island. The queen knelt again. This time she touched her daughter's cheek, not as royalty, but as something closer to real. When she looked up, she didn't thank him. That word was too small, but she did nod. And in the corner of the chamber, unnoticed, a second blade fell, not made of steel, but of pride slipping loose in her chest. The summons came the next morning. A blood-red sigil burned across the sky above the Capitol spire, the sign reserved only for accusations against the crown. It hadn't been used in 3 generations. Not since the last monarch was executed by her own high tribunal for forgetting the nature of conquest. Now it glowed again, cast by her own war council, her own empire, her own shadow. The queen walked into the hall of judgment unguarded. No armor, no crown, just her breath, steady, and her silence, heavier than any metal she had ever worn. The council chamber was a pit of firelight and accusation. 13 seats, 13 voices, all of them sharpened with certainty. You violated protocol. You permitted unsanctioned influence. You bonded your heir to a species classified as obsolete. She lives, the queen said. They didn't flinch. That is not the point. She was poisoned under your own roof, and the creature who saved her is a man. She interrupted. Not a creature, a father. The word unsettled them more than any threat could have. It echoed across the stone like a heresy. A father, as if love could be spoken aloud in this chamber. One of the senior judges leaned forward, robes rustling like dry leaves. This is not about sentiment. It is about legacy. Our empire was built on dominance, not dependency. The queen stepped closer. You say that word like it's weakness. It island. She let the silence stretch until it hurt. I've conquered worlds that screamed my name into extinction, she said quietly. I've silenced rebellions with a glance, but my daughter cried in hunger, and I could do nothing. Not one of you could, but he could. He did. So tell me, is that weakness? They didn't answer, because they couldn't. A new projection lit above them, surveillance footage from the previous night. The human feeding the child, holding her. Her laugh like light in a cave no one remembered how to leave. It played in total silence. The kind of silence that forces reckoning. "This tribunal will reconvene in 3 cycles," the lead judge announced. "Until then, the human will be isolated." "No." The word dropped like a hammer. Everyone looked at her. "You called me here to judge me," the queen said. "Fine, but you will not use my daughter's joy as a weapon against her. And if we insist," she took 1 step forward. Just 1. It was enough. "Then you will learn," she said, "that I was never dangerous because of my armies." They dismissed her after that. She was neither condemned nor cleared. The verdict would come later, after they figured out how to write treason in a language that feared softness more than war. She left the hall alone, but when she returned to the nursery and saw her daughter curled against that man's chest once more, breathing deeply, cheeks pink with healing, she knew something none of them would ever admit. She had already chosen her side. The empire did not fall that day. No cities burned, no towers cracked, no statues were toppled. Instead, it began quietly with a woman unlatching the joints of her own armor. She stood in her private chamber, alone, facing a full-length obsidian mirror that reflected not just her form, but the years carved into it. Every plate of metal, every etched sigil of victory, every blade built into her gauntlets, all removed one by one. Her hands shook once when she reached for the seal at her throat. The clasp she'd worn since she was 13, the one they said marked her as untouchable. She touched it, then opened it. When the final piece of her armor lay on the ground like a discarded skin, she stepped back and breathed. Not the breath of a queen, not the breath of a conqueror, just a mother, just a woman who had realized that fear and obedience were not the same as loyalty. Outside the palace walls, rumors had already spread, that she had bent to a human, that she had failed the trial, that the council had stripped her of power. None of it was true. And yet, she did not fight the whispers, because she no longer needed their permission to walk away. She went to the child first, kissed her forehead as she slept, whispered something no one would ever hear again, a name older than empires, a lullaby from before she had learned silence. Then she found him. He was in the east garden, sitting by the fountain, mending the strap of the child's play harness. He looked up when he heard her steps, then froze. She wasn't wearing armor. She wasn't surrounded by guards. She wasn't a queen. Not anymore. She said nothing for a long moment, just looked at him, really. Looked as if seeing not just the man, but the gravity he carried, the grief, the patience, the ridiculous quiet hope he still dared to hold in his chest. Finally, she spoke. "Would you come with me?" He blinked. "Where?" "Anywhere," she said. "Everywhere." He stood. "Are you being hunted?" "Probably. And this isn't a trap?" "If it is," she said, "I'm walking into it too." He looked down at the harness in his hands. The child's name was stitched into the fabric, not in her royal tongue, but in his. She had asked for it that way. He nodded once. They left that night. No procession, no announcement, no warship escort, just the 3 of them. A former queen, a broken father, and a child with 2 worlds in her blood. As they stepped through the outer gates, the guards did not salute. They bowed, not because of what she had taken, but because of what she had chosen to give up. And somewhere, far above, in the galactic records that rarely recorded mercy, a new entry flickered into being. Status, absent. Reason, love. They lived in a district without names, just coordinates and wind, the kind of place maps forgot, too small to conquer, too far to fear. There were no banners here, no ranks, just sand that sang when the sun fell low, and old machines that breathed like rusted lungs. The girl grew up between them. She ran barefoot through narrow corridors, her laughter echoing off stone. Some days she called him Dad, other days she called her mother Queen, but always with a grin as if the word had changed shape in her mouth. The woman who once ruled empires now grew herbs in a tin basin and used them to flavor stew. She never quite learned to braid hair. He never quite got used to someone trusting him without question, but they tried. Together, each evening, the 3 of them gathered around the same battered pot, steam curling into the air like memory. The girl stirred with a spoon too big for her hand. He taste-tested like it was sacred. She added too much salt. He said it was perfect, No one spoke of the empire anymore, but sometimes she'd draw things in the dirt, strange symbols that looked half like language, half like longing. One day, she held up a scrap of paper and pointed. "What does this mean?" The symbol was a fusion, half Terran letter, half royal glyph, a scribble only a child would invent. He looked at it, puzzled. The Queen stepped closer, studied the lines. "It doesn't exist," he said. "Not yet," the Queen replied. So they gave it meaning. Home, not the place, but the act, the rhythm, the way they took care of one another. The word caught on. She etched it into the walls. He stitched it into her tunic. She whispered it to herself before sleep. Years passed quietly. The girl grew taller, smarter. Her laughter became questions. Her questions became purpose. She asked why empires fell, why some people were feared, why others were forgotten. They answered the best they could, and one day, she stood between them and said, "I want to teach." "Teach what?" her father asked. She smiled. "How to eat when you're hungry, how to speak when you're scared, how to hold someone without hurting them." The Queen's breath caught in her throat, not because she feared what the girl would become, but because for the first time in her life, she saw the future and did not brace for war. That night, after the girl had fallen asleep, they sat on the steps outside the little home. The stars above them were quiet. No alarms, no orders. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "The crown?" "No. Being feared." She shook her head. "I used to think that was power. Now I think it was noise. And this?" She leaned her head on his shoulder. "This is peace." They sat that way until dawn. No titles, no chains. Just a father, just a mother, and a child who had redefined them both.